It's my great honor to introduce Dr. Robin Nelson, who is joining us from the Department of Anthropology at Skidmore College, where she is an assistant professor and the director for the Laboratory for Biocultural Human Adaptation Research, the newly minted, newly named laboratory. Very exciting. She's a biological anthropologist who utilizes evolutionary theory and studies of the link between human social behavior and sociality and health outcomes. Most recently, she's been working in Jamaica to look at health outcomes, including anthropometrics and biomarkers of health, and the residential context for Jamaican children. This project focuses on the growth and development of children living in state-sponsored residential childcare facilities, and I think is a really important contribution to the discussion we're kind of trying to have here on a broad level, because it looks at not only the challenging context in which many of these children are living, bringing in kind of cultural perspectives about family and household and caregiving, but also looking at resilience and what it is about some of these specific institutional contexts that really are offering support to children and allowing some of them to thrive despite fairly adverse circumstances. So I think Robin is really, or Dr. Nelson, is really going to contribute mightily to the conversation we're trying to have here, and it's a great honor to have her at Notre Dame. Thanks.
So thank you everyone for having me. I will give the same disclaimer that EA gave a while ago. When I first finished my doctorate, I postdoced in the lab that EA and Lee were finishing up their dissertations in. So we're old friends, so no formality needed here. But I'm going to talk to you today about who counts in terms of investment in children. And I'm coming from this, as Lee kind of said, from an evolutionary perspective and an emphasis on kin, so biological kin, and parents. And I really wanted to ask with my own research, what happens when those people are not available to provide that kind of care? So in the anthropological literature, right now, there seems to be a prevalence of literature, findings, studies on reproductive technologies. So if you're going to ask the question, who's a parent, you're going to get a lot of information on things like IVF, in vitro, surrogacy. And there seems to be a big shift in the field towards that kind of conversation about parenting and about how we bring children forth. But there's, another dynamic to this. We have a kind of classic example. So I have a 2-year-old at home, so that's me 3 years ago. We can have this kind of technical discussion about the biology of childbearing, right? And we can kind of talk about that all we want. But we can also be interested in these other more nuanced aspects of what it means to be a parent. So we can think about psychological investment, as we've been thinking about today, attachment, how we help children with their emotional regulation, social investment and who in the community is kind of doing this kind of care, and also material investment. So literally, what resources do these caretakers have to bring forth and help these children with? And then we're also having to think about, and should be thinking about, and there's more and more discussion about, the fluidity of parenthood, right? So how people move in and out of being parents via different kinds of policies and practices in their communities. So this could be formal adoption, this could be informal fostering, but you could kind of shift your status as a caretaker depending on whatever is kind of culturally appropriate and the needs of the young people in the communities in which we study. And so I'm interested in caretaking and child health in Jamaica. And so today I'll talk a little bit about how do parents help to create gendered and culturally situated childhoods. And I think that the gendered piece for Jamaica will bring forth, I hope, what is pretty interesting findings. I think they're pretty interesting, and they speak to some older studies in cultural anthropology that show kind of gendered investment by parents in boys and girls, that is differential investment in boys and girls. We'll think a little bit specifically about my particular research in institutional childcare settings. So I'm working specifically with children who have been orphaned, and they've been orphaned for a variety of reasons. But the assumption in a lot of the literature was that being an orphan would be bad. If you look at the literature out of Eastern Europe, if you look at the literature out of parts of Asia, there's really bad metrics on what happens to children's lives when they're in these institutional care settings. And when I was first thinking about the study, that was my presumption going in. And a very wise colleague said, I think you need to have a more open-ended hypothesis on that, because if these children are coming from a particularly traumatic home environment, then this more stable care environment might be actually better than where they're coming from, right? So I want to think a little bit about how quality of care varies in these different spaces. And finally, I'm specifically interested in the implications of these caretaking relationships and these different living contexts for child health and development. So I conduct my research in Mandeville, Jamaica. It's in the central mountainous region of the country. It's about, if you've ever been to Jamaica on vacation, it's about 2.5 hours from wherever you visited, if not further away. It's not a place that folks typically visit if they are going on vacation to the country, and that's typically the context that we have for Jamaica in the US. I started working there in 2004, and I started at one project, and that project has since concluded, and then picked up another project in 2010 that included two different seasons of data collection plus a pilot season. So I'm very familiar with the community now, and they're also familiar with me, and know that I'm going to be asking them probing questions that they may or may not want to answer, but luckily I'm part of the community as much as you can be as an anthropologist. And so this is the area that I work in, and I put these pictures up so that you can get an idea of how densely populated Manchester Parish is, and Mandeville proper, where I work. This is in effect urban anthropology, right? This is not anthropology in a more rural space, and so there's different dynamics that you have to deal with in terms of meeting people, right? Finding a population to sample, getting access to them. It is a bustling city. It's about the 5th largest urban center on the island. It is also relatively financially stable as compared to other parts of Jamaica, which aren't. And so in our kind of understanding of Jamaica, we kind of think about Jamaica as being, at least the commercials tell us, as being, beautiful island, sandy, nice place. Jamaica has a murder rate that's 10 times that of the United States when controlled per capita for population size. And so there are parts of Jamaica that are in fact very risky and very challenging to live in, and some of that is mediated by poverty, right? And this area is less impoverished because it's near some aluminum mines, but it still has lots of the same problems and same issues that'll become relevant for this study in terms of out-migration of people for work and different opportunities and low education rates and that kind of thing. So some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about child health or child flourishing in my community is kind of, one, this kind of really blunt proxy of how healthy they are, how are they growing, right, physically. Also, their lived experiences. What are their day-to-day lives like? Much like what Dr. Fouts was saying, what can we say about what they're doing every single day? What is their lived experience? And also, received investment, right? Who is investing in them? How can we kind of measure these things? This young woman in this picture, she'll come up again. Her uniform, if you're not from this area, you might not know this, but her uniform, all the kids in Jamaica wear uniforms. So the uniform isn't exactly diagnostic of class, but her uniform is, because that uniform is for the elite private school in the community. And all the children and all the adults in this community know what uniform matches up with what school and what marker that gives you in terms of class. So I used Haley as an example because I know her family very well, and they're one of the more well-off and comfortable families, and everything about her outfit, her uniform can give you that information about her lived experience and her received investment. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just for some ethnographic background, about the way that children are kind of thought of in the Caribbean, the way they're perceived, and I hope that you will forgive me kind of a bit of a cultural mixed metaphor here, because Timoun Sirish is actually a Haitian Creole phrase, and this is Jamaica, but I had done some early research in Haiti, and so this kind of gives, it's a really good framework for the way that we think about children in the Caribbean. So Timoun Sirish means the children are the riches, right? So very kind of pronatal, pro-family environment. And in fact, even when I was in graduate school at around 26 years old, and I was there doing research, and I was single and I had no children, people kind of did not understand who I was, my orientation to the world, or if I could appropriately understand their lives as adults, because clearly I had not started adulthood, right? Because I didn't have a kid. There's lots of good data from articles by Honda starting in 1999 and Safa, 95, and Safa in 1999, that there's a high proportion of female-headed households in the Caribbean. And so with those female-headed households, we see lots of the dynamics that we see in other parts of the world where we have female-headed households. So we have differential spending towards kids and not for items of leisure, right? So there's lots of good evidence out of the US that when women are kind of running household finances, lots of the money and resources go towards the kids and less goes towards material items for the house. And with these female-headed households, and I'll talk about this in a few slides, men are kind of moving in and out of these households. They may be in the household permanently, they may be in the household semi-permanently, but there's a high proportion of households where women are the primary adult caregiver in that home. There's also gendered spending, and so that you see women kind of spending money in particular ways, but also spending money on their children in different ways, depending on whether they have lots of female children or male children, with girls getting a kind of increased investment, both psychosocial but also material, around their education. And then one interesting dynamic that's been reported on for nearly 100 years now is the house-yard complex in the Caribbean, and this is basically exactly what it sounds like. You have a house and you have the yard around it, but that it kind of falls into this classic anthropological trope of private space and public space, and so that the house itself is private space, even though other family members move in and out of it quite a bit, and the yard space is extended family space, and it's also public space, and so that you might have a lot of families doing cooperative caregiving in that yard space, watching out for kids who are playing in that yard space, cooking together, doing laundry together. And the way that that's kind of amplified is via familial inheritance of land, so that one of the kind of goals for a lot of Jamaican adults is they say, do you own a piece of the rock? And to own a piece of the rock means you own a piece of land in Jamaica. So that you might be working abroad, but you're sending money home so you can own a piece of the rock. And once you own that land, it's split up between your family members when you pass away. And there's bilateral inheritance so that both daughters and sons can inherit land. And so what you have are these big pieces of land that now have houses kind of dotting all over the land, and the yard space is becoming less and less and less, but you have brothers and sisters and cousins all living in one area. And so even with the rise of kind of migration throughout the island for work, and people moving off the island in order to do other things, they're often, in terms of employment, they're often sending money back home to begin building houses on a piece of land in Jamaica. So one thing that I wanted to think about in light of our discussion of child flourishing is the way that we, in WEIRD, right, acronym WEIRD, populations think about parental investment, right? And we often think about it with respect to, even as we problematize it, but with respect to marriage and coupling, right? So that we think about who are the caregivers, two partners, or maybe a single mom, but two partners investing in a child. And one thing that's unique or I should at least say different about the sample that I work with, is that you have to, by necessity, decouple parental investment from parental romantic relationships. Because it's not that the parents aren't both investing, they are, but you can't think about it as being as clear-cut as if both parents in the house, they're investing in a particular way, and if they're not in the house together, they're not investing in that way, and that you could kind of break those off into operationalized categories. It's much messier than that. So in the West Indies, we talk about visiting unions, conjugal unions, formal marriage, and these are all different levels of commitment and investment. Visiting being a man and a woman, and these are very heteronormative categories, and that's due to necessity in Jamaica as real issues with homophobia. So that's what I'll be talking about, is kind of very heteronormative categories. But visiting unions, kind of a more informal, often early relationship, conjugal unions being a committed relationship but not necessarily living together. Visiting unions literally means they come and visit and then they sometimes leave. Conjugal unions, more committed. You could be in conjugal unions for 20 years. Formal marriage, you know, what we all think of as marriage. But these things do not necessarily lead to each other in some kind of linear fashion. And just because you're in a very committed conjugal union doesn't mean you'll ever formally get married. And it may not even mean you live together. And so we have to think about parental investment in that context. It's being a little bit complicated. And so in this picture, I chose these two pictures because the woman with her son on her lap is actually was married at the time of the interview, and this was rare, and she was very proud of this, right? And she made sure that I knew it very early on in the interview, that she was married, and that she lived with her husband, and that, you know, what he did for a living. And so there are these kind of markers of socioeconomic status and wealth and comfort that go along with these categories, even if a lot of people are doing these visiting in conjugal unions. And the young man on your right, with his daughter giving him a piece of chicken to eat and scowling at me for taking a picture. He was his daughter's primary caregiver, and the mother of his child were no longer in a committed romantic relationship. They were still on relatively good terms. He did a lot of care for that young woman, and he had another romantic partner, if not more than one. I actually think he had more than one, but the one that I got to know, because at a certain point they realized that Robin can't know all my girlfriends. This is true. The one that I knew as well, she spent a lot of time with his daughter, and she was doing a lot of investment in his daughter, even though her mother was on the island and doing a lot of care. So, you know, residence and relationship status are not necessarily linked directly to investment patterns. And so the first study I did, which I'll just call Men and Mothers, just to give it a little title for here, was conducted in the early to mid-2000s, and it included 82 men and women, 18 to 48 years of age, and they ranged in terms of socioeconomic status, education, employment histories, and familial histories. You know, who did they live with, how many siblings they had, those kinds of things. The thing that I wanted you to look at, kind of pay attention here, is that about half of both males and females had children in this early study, and almost everyone said they were in some kind of relationship, right? So you have this, you know, breakdown here. And so I put engaged and married, and in technical Caribbean literature, I would split those up. But for the purposes of this discussion, I put engaged and married together, single together, and then visiting union as denoting a kind of informal relationship to some extent together. And I think because I had many more people in this sample who were in early relationships, and I think that's partly because the sample skewed kind of young. So we had lots of people who were in their kind of, you know, late 20s at that time. But the thing that is of interest to me is that the number of children, there was no statistical significance in terms of difference if you looked at relationship status and the number of children that you had, right? So that you could be single and have 1 to 3 children or 4 more children. You could, you know, be in a visiting union and have, you know, a relationship that's significant to you and have no children. Or have 1 to 3 children, or 4 more children. And it's only when you kind of get to engaged or married where you see fewer people, significantly fewer people, who have no children, and you have a lot of people who have 1 to 3 children. So the point here is just that these two things cannot be tracked together automatically, right? You can't track relationship status with investment. And so thinking about that, I wanted to kind of know a little bit more about kids' lives and how they're faring in this kind of diversity of relationships. And so Sargent and Harris have a really important paper out from 1992 that talks a little bit about how girls are favored in Jamaica. And this was kind of counter to presumed understandings of kids' lives at that time in Jamaica, because Jamaica is presumed to be a very patriarchal space, and in some ways it is. But girls are, the way that this kind of patriarchal practice plays itself out in Jamaica, and this shows up later on in my own data about children in orphanages, is that girls are kept close to home. Girls are encouraged to help out with home, to help out with cooking, to help out with, and to be in the house space, and boys are told that they can go run the street. You go run the street, you're making a mess in my house, you go out, you go do something else, and the girl's forced to help. Well, what that means is that she gets to nibble at the pot while she's cooking. She's encouraged to sit down and do her homework, right? And so you see girls finishing their education, for higher levels of education, more than their male peers, and also the very basic metrics of growth and development, they were doing a little bit better. We also see kind of experiences, Flynn in England have done a ton of work, and Shivana's had done an ethnographic piece on boyhood and stress. Flynn in England's work is on stress in the Caribbean, in Dominica, and just talking about kind of the way that boys get scolded and how it increases their cortisol rates right after a kind of immediate kind of punitive experience with a caregiver. And that's kind of interesting to me because girls have a different relationship to caregivers because of how close they are to them in the home all the time. And Shivana's work is also kind of reinforcing the idea that boys, specifically in Jamaica and in Trinidad, are encouraged to kind of go out and play while girls are encouraged to stay close to home. So, right, so girls' responsibilities and boys' spaces, right? So girls' responsibilities to the home and boys' spaces out in public. So, we were talking already today a little bit about alloparents, right? And one of the things that we think about from an evolutionary perspective is not just parents, and Flynn in England's work talks about this a little bit, but not just parents who are doing some of the care, but those other people in a child's life who are helping to take care of them. And we know, we just talked about whether it takes a village is an appropriate way to think about these things, right? Or whether we should think about the village as kind of supporting and holding up mom, right? But we can all kind of agree that one single parent isn't doing this alone, right? There's always other people who are kind of coming in, and this might be in the form of formal paid daycare, or it might be in the form of family members that live in very close proximity, or community members, as in the case in Congo. And I kind of wanted to know a little bit about that part of childhood and parental investment in Jamaica. And so we know from an evolutionary perspective that alloparents are crucial. So in one population in Central Africa, it was shown that 1 through 4 month olds spent less than 40% of their time in the arms of their parents, right? So alloparents doing a tremendous amount of work in this community. And so I'm thinking about the importance of alloparents and how, and I think this is in no part, I was not actually, I was telling Lee this earlier, but I was not actually pregnant with my son when I formulated this study, and then got pregnant in the field when I started collecting the data. So now the questions have a different kind of relevance to me personally. But thinking about who is taking care of kids, if we understand from an evolutionary perspective that these alloparents are absolutely crucial, and if I know from my ethnographic research on the first project that a lot of different people are taking care of these kids that are in this community, what happens when there are no alloparents around? The kind of alloparents that we designate from an evolutionary perspective, close family, married in kin, that kind of thing. I wanted to know what kind of care children are receiving when they live in institutional settings. And can the kind of care that they're receiving be characterized as institutional alloparenting? Is it that intense? Is it that invested? Or is it a completely different kind of care by pay, care for hire, and so it should be considered a different kind of category? And so we know that, in the Caribbean specifically, familial alloparenting happens quite a bit due to necessity and via reciprocity. So I go away to the Grand Cayman Islands for several months, and this happened with lots of adults in my study, and my kitten goes and lives with my sister for a few months. And then when my work visa is up and I come back, I take her kid and she goes away for a few months. And so there's a lot of reciprocal interactions with familial alloparenting. And so the kind of counter-Haitian saying that goes with Timoun si riche is Timoun si moun, which is the children are the world's children, meaning like we all take care of the children, right? They're that important to all of us. And so we have lots of familial fostering, and we have gendered migrations. And so you see what's happening right now in the Caribbean is that there's a work stream of women leaving the Caribbean for work, employment in Great Britain and in Canada and in the United States, and there are other people in that community who take care of their small dependent kids. And so in this picture, what you actually have is this child is this man's nephew, and he did a non-insignificant amount of care, and this is his mother, and his mother has traveled for work, and now the nephew is actually away for work. And so this is right after he was born, and this is when I went back and he was 4 years old. Right, so what becomes of children whose parents can no longer invest? And in what ways are children's lives impacted by residential context and caretaking practice? And an earlier study I did is a pilot study that then I couldn't continue because of the coup in Haiti back in 2004. I stayed in a boarding house where this woman was taking care of all of these children, none of whom were directly related to her. I mean, they were, but distantly related to her. And she was their primary caregiver I don't want to necessarily link it to the Rest of X system in Haiti, which you might know something about, but it's a system where kids will go stay with another adult who is supposed to provide them shelter and money for school and clothes, but it's often an abused system, and so you have a lot of kids who are kind of trafficked around. This is not quite that, but it was a little bit close. These kids did quite a bit of care for this woman, and they were provided fees for school. And so I kind of wanted to think about the similar kind of dynamic happening in Jamaica and what happens to those kids who can't live with their family members anymore. And so in this study, I looked at children's homes, which is what we now call orphanages, right? They're not really called orphanages anymore, they're called children's homes. In Manchester Parish, 125 children, 4 months to 18 years of age, and I also interviewed child caretakers and community members. And then I was able to actually go back last summer and follow up with 65 of the 125 children. Several others had aged out of the system, and some had been moved around so much that I actually couldn't figure out what home they were now in because they weren't in the same home. And these homes are in different parts of Manchester Parish. And so this home is called Guppy Pond, this home is called Pear Tree Place, and this home is called Irie House, and I'll come back and talk about them. But for context, I should note that Jamaica is the size of Connecticut, okay, the entire island. It's not very big at all. Manchester Parish is quite small, and there are 6 children's homes, one of whom that I could not get into because the boys that are in that home are thought to be troubled. And by that, it doesn't mean the kind of, it doesn't mean any kind of necessarily psychological diagnosis. It's more that they've gotten in trouble in school and that kind of thing and aren't able to live at home. And so they wouldn't let me work with those kids. But that is to say there are a lot of children who fall into this category in a very small country. So many so, and it's so kind of culturally taboo to think about these kids in this context, that when I mentioned to friends from the first study that I was going to be doing this study and I was going to be looking at kids in children's homes, they all presumed I'd have to go to Kingston to do it. right? That I'd have to go to the Capitol, which is kind of deals with many more issues of poverty. And nobody, when they started counting up, no one had quite realized that there were 6 children's homes in the parish, that there were that many kids at risk in the parish. And so, in addition to thinking about those kids, I wanted to get a comparative sample of kids who were living with their family members. And so I have 119 kids who are living with their family members, 4 months to 18 years old, also living in Manchester Parish, throughout the parish. And that's my one-time informant, now field assistant, Bridget, doing an interview. And the reason why I chose this photo, even though the framing might look a little crazy, is because you can see her parent here. That's her father kind of watching over the interview to make sure that whatever we covered in the interview was kind of appropriate. So he sat through one interview, and then we interviewed her and a bunch of her cousins, and then he was kind of like, it's okay, I can leave now. We have to imagine some of the kids we interviewed didn't have that kind of oversight, even if the parents gave permission. And so with the ethnographic data, we were able to, gather basic information: age, number of siblings, activities that they like to do, dietary information, access to medical care, quality and quantity of friendships, and psychosocial and financial support networks. And so the quality and quantity of friendships piece is kind of a culturally contextualized question. Lots of adults in my initial study had said things like, I don't trust anyone, I don't tell anybody anything about my personal life. And I would kind of unpack that a little bit with these adults, and they would still kind of talk about maybe only talking to their sister or their cousin, but not a lot of people. So I wanted to ask a similar kind of question to kids who are experiencing kind of psychosocial stress. Who are they confiding in? Who are they dealing with? And so one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is that if you looked at what kids did in terms of activities, and if I just kind of look at it as playing in blue, like, what do you like to do? And the kids would literally say, I like to play. I said, what do you like to play? I like to play football. I like to play baseball. I like to run around. Like, what do you mean, lady? You don't know what I mean when I say I play. The green is talk or share, and that's also how they characterize it. Like, I talk and I share with that person. And the little yellow bar down here is to watch TV or leisure. With the girls, just because of statistics, it's not significantly different. Whether you live in a children's home or you live with your family, you kind of do these things in equal proportion, and these are middle childhood children, so these are young kids, 5 to 11 years old. With the boys, though, if you live in a children's home, you're significantly less likely to say that you talk or share as one of the activities that you like to do. Right? So it's kind of clarifying that they don't have that same network, and they know they don't, right? It's just not something they're willing to do. The other piece that kind of comes into it, if you look at late childhood, so kids who are like 12 to 18 years old going through adolescence. With girls, it's not statistically significant, these differences. And with boys, again, if you're in the children's home, when they get older, though, they start saying that they do like to talk and share. And in fact, when I had, when we interviewed the older boys, they seemed to have a much more extensive social network than the younger boys did. The younger boys seemed to be much more kind of withdrawn. The older boys were much more willing to talk about who their friends were, to name them, and to talk about discussions they had recently had with their friends. So I also am interested in anthropometrics and biometrics, as Lee mentioned in the introduction, and so I take height and length, weight, subcutaneous fat, blood pressure, mid-upper arm circumference, head circumference, and I take some saliva samples, but those haven't been analyzed yet, so I didn't include that here. But I take saliva samples to think about things like immune response and stress. Oops, sorry, there we go. And so, not necessarily surprisingly, kids who, and these are middle childhood, so the younger kids, and that's where you see the largest effect in terms of health, which makes sense, right? Because these kids are in these critical periods of growth and development. Kids who are living with their family members, boys specifically living with their family members, are doing significantly better than boys at Irie House or boys at Pear Tree Place in terms of height for age. Skin fold measurements, some skin fold measurements, you see the same dynamic happen here. The one thing I want you to take note of, and I'll kind of talk about this on the next slide, is there's actually not a significant difference in terms of height for age for kids who are living with family members and kids who are living at Guppy Pond. And so when you look at, when you look at children's homes, specifically, you just break down children's homes with the boys, and you look for skin fold measurements or mid-upper arm circumference. What you see is the boys at Guppy Pond in early childhood, again, thriving as compared to their male peers. With the girls, we don't see this dynamic. We don't see it in early childhood, and we don't see it in late childhood. And with all the kids, once they get into late childhood, the effect falls away. So you don't see it as much. You see kind of crucial effects early in life. And so what we know in terms of quality of care issues is that, and so these are kids who are living with family members, and these are kids who I followed up with in that second field season, and I was taking a picture of them at the children's home. What we know in terms of quality of care through extensive interviews with the caretakers, both parents in the community and parents at the child care facility, is that what the primary caretaker was doing at Guppy Pond was qualitatively different than the caretaker and directors at the other two homes. She had instituted a system where the kids had one singular person amongst everyone on the staff that they could go and speak to when they were feeling stressed out. And she initially, and this was kind of the challenging thing about being an anthropologist, is that we don't do clinical work, right? We might collaborate with clinicians, but we don't do clinical work. And so one of the challenging things is when I showed up, she was hoping I was a psychologist so I could provide counseling, which is like the worst thing to say. Like, no, I can't do that, but I can ask you a lot of questions. You know, I mean, nobody wants to say that, right? But when I would ask her, I had about 5 hours of interview data with her at 2 different times, 2 years apart. And one of the things that I was able to assess is that this system she had created, where every kid had someone they could talk to, she told me, I didn't care whether they were the laundry person, I didn't care whether it was the cook in the kitchen, I didn't care whether it was janitorial staff. That child needed to know that there was someone who would listen to them. And no other home had done that. And I've since that time found lots of literature showing that that kind of recreating of an attachment relationship with a caregiver in an institutional care setting can actually help improve child health outcomes. Because one of the things that happens that's kind of correlated to some of these health measures that you see is insecure attachment, and lots of folks have talked about this already, leads to feeding challenges, right? And the other thing that she does that's qualitatively different, markedly different, is that she has an open pantry policy so that the kids can come and eat whenever they want, whatever they want. And one thing that she noted was that a lot of the kids, when they would first arrive at the home, and I should say Guppy Pond is an all-boys home also, okay? So there are no girls there to compare them to the girls at the other homes. That when the kids first arrive there, they often hoard food. And so she'll go to clean up their rooms, and there will be, all kinds of breads and things in their bed, right? And she has to kind of convince them that they will be able to eat. My field assistant, who is born and raised in Mandeville, noted that in people's homes, there's no open pantry policy, right? So she is creating like a context that is even culturally different than what folks would do in their own homes for these kids. And I think it has quite an impact. All the directors talked about not having enough resources, as you may imagine. And they all talked about, and this was interesting, how the kids had given them kin names. Mama Palmer, Auntie Palmer, the kids had given them those names. And I just kind of want to finish here by talking a little bit about shifting investments. So even in these homes where these folks are doing the best they can, one of the things that is very easy to note when you do this research is that all the homes are not funded equally. Now, they are state regulated, they are not state sponsored, but the 2 homes that I have in this picture are both run by one Christian charity, international Christian charity. And what you can see here is a brand new play facility for the kids here in terms of, we think about activity and stimulation for young children. And here, if you look deep into the background, you can see kind of broken fence here, and there's a play facility back here. It has no swings on it, and there are no seats on the seesaw. The kids are allocated to these different homes randomly. It's whoever has space when their number comes up in the system. And so if by chance you end up in this home. You can think about the difference in experience that you would have if you just had ended up over here. That being said, the home with the really nice the really nice play facility also had these amazing dorms. And I say amazing because these are college-level dorms that they had for the young men and women, individual rooms. They only had to they didn't have to share a room, which is unheard of in most people's families. And they had a single bathroom that they had to share. They also had a really extensive area for young children and babies, complete with mosquito netting and everything else you might need. This entire dorm had been defunded and shut down when I went back in 2013. So those girls were no longer able to stay in their own rooms. So in terms of who counts, the thing that I come away with this project is that context of investment matters. And we already know that, but it's very clear in this particular study. The effect that I see in terms of health and even discussions of quality of life that the kids give me is much stronger in the younger age cohorts. And that these kids, in terms of how many end up in institutional care facilities in the first place, reveals some of the gendered lives of children. There are many more boys living in children's homes in Manchester Parish than there are girls. And it speaks to the literature that I cited early on about the kind of investment, differential investment boys and girls experience early on. So my future analysis, I'm going to be doing, looking at right now the repeated measures of health for the children in the children's homes to kind of see if we can see any change over a 2-year period. And also I'm in the process of analyzing saliva data to kind of see what kind of nuanced effects that can tell us. So thank you.
I have some questions, just clarification too. The gendered experiences, yeah. I was just wondering if you think that's related to the matriarchal kind of society that's set up, and so then boys aren't given that home attention from the fathers or the males as much, or? So,
yeah, so in part. So part of what's happening there is that there's even like a saying in Jamaican culture, like girls will never leave you. And boys will leave you. Boys will get up and they'll find another woman and they're going to go off and get married, and your daughter will always be your daughter, right? And so part of what's happening is that women are the primary people in the home. They're then raising up their girls in that model. And there are a lot of fathers who are in the home doing a lot of care. There are fathers outside the home doing a lot of care, but there are a lot of fathers who also aren't doing as much care, and that's much more variable. And it's also much more culturally shameful for, and this is the same in the US, for a mother to not be doing care. And so there's a lot of pressure on mothers to be doing that investment, and I think that filters right on down, and the girls get that message very early, and they're kind of pulled into that system in a different way than boys are. Yeah.
Very different from the Italians who have a lot of mother's boys, right?
Yes.
And they stay home till they're 40 or 50 or all their lives.
Yeah, yeah.
Another question is, did you have information about what age they arrived at the home, and why they arrived?
That's the best question, and no. So I wish I could tell you that. That was the forbidden part of this study, that if I was going to do this study, I couldn't ask questions about that, because the idea was, and you know, I have to respect them because they're doing the work, but the kids' experiences had been so traumatic, and that issues around confidence and you know, we'll let you look at them now, but we don't know what you're going to do with their story if we told you what happened to them before they got here. So out of respect for their privacy, I couldn't know that. One director did give me a range of experiences that kids had had, and for the most part, they were at the far end of what we would experience, what we would think of as being bad. So we're talking one child, actually more than one child, had observed parents murdering someone else. Kids who had become street children because they had been living on the street because they had been so neglected. So at the very far end of trauma, these kids had experienced before they had gotten to these homes. Yeah.
One more question, and that is, or observation, the single rooms kind of dorm. In most of the world, sleeping alone is kind of anathema and actually a punishment or torturous or whatever. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
So it's funny. We walked in, and my research assistant, who, you know, for everyone who has them in another country where they work, you know they are your right-hand man, because they're going to give you the initial response of whether this is a good or bad thing and kind of get you out of your own space about whether this is good. And she was like, I can't, this is amazing. And so we asked the girls, do you like this? You like your rooms? And they were like, yeah, I have my own space, and I put my stuff up on the wall. They were excited. They were thrilled because they got to manipulate the environment in the way that they wanted to, in the same way kids in the US, like teenagers never come out of their room and that whole thing. The girls enjoyed that opportunity. The rest of the day, though, they're not allowed to hang out in their rooms very much. So they weren't allowed to kind of retreat there. They had to do a lot of chores, a lot of activities, meals with everyone, and then they're going to school. So this really was just sleeping at nighttime, and they really kind of enjoyed having that space.
I wanted to ask about the boys who were sent out onto the street. Is there any sort of gang culture? Is it a problem in any way, or are they just happily playing?
So gang culture in Jamaica is actually a really, really, really big problem. Another really, just to emphasize that, but it's a very big problem. The little boys, though, don't get caught up in it as much as you would imagine, adolescents. So boys, by the time they're like 14, 15, it's really quite a problem. And part of the reason is the same reason we see gang culture proliferate all over the world. Reduced educational opportunities, the idea that school is going to somehow lead to a better life has been, you know, sufficiently dismantled in Jamaica. Folks know that there's very few employment opportunities after school, so why do I need to invest in school right now? And so they kind of get caught up in drug trade and gang culture. And there's a lot of literature supporting the idea that this risk is well known, but there's also limited resources, and so somebody has to go play outside, like managing the family and all of these resources, and so the boys can go play, they'll be okay. And then, you know, they do their best to pull them back in if they see them getting in trouble, but that's the kind of gender dynamic of play. Thank you.